All right. So, welcome to Introduction to Virtual Machines by me, Arturo Galvan. So, today we will be doing a demo and introductions on how to create a new virtual machine onto your computer and what exactly they are, and dive into why you want to learn it and go just basically a QA afterwards. So, without further ado, so who am I? I am Arturo. I am a fourth year senior. I'm interested in iOS development, also artificial intelligence. In the links, which in the slides I will be sharing later on, you can check out my LinkedIn profile so you can connect with me if you want. So this is me, and let's go right next to it. So why should you learn virtual machines? So basically, there's 4 points. The first one is businesses want to leverage their resources. So if a business has a server, they want to not just have one dedicated server for one specific operating system. They want to use that and leverage it so they can host different operating systems and have different microservices on it. So virtual machines are useful for that type of strategy. So using how to create knowledge on how to create one and how to maintain one is highly beneficial for you. So another thing is learning a different operating system. So if you only know how to use a MacBook and not a Windows or vice versa, and if you want to learn the other, you can easily use a virtual machine. Additionally, a different operating system is considered Linux, but there's different varieties. So a few examples are Linux Mint, Ubuntu, and there are several others that exist. So learning a different operating system would be useful for you, as well as testing software. So testing software in an isolated sandbox is highly beneficial for when you don't know what your software could do, or if it's malicious software you download, you want to test it out. So things like that, that's when it's useful to have a virtual machine. And why? Fourth point, because you're going to be using it in any type of industry you go into. There's going to be some type of application for virtualization. So what is a VM exactly? So to break it down, your computer has components, specifically three types of components. The RAM, which is short-term memory that it can store things, and then processing power, that's the actual motherboard, if you want to consider that the CPU chip, and then storage capacity. So that is your actual hard disk or your solid state drive. If you have enough RAM, processing power, and storage capacity, you can run a hypervisor program to emulate a guest operating system isolated from the host operating system. So on the slides, this gives you a link to VirtualBox requirements for the host operating system. But to break it down, you just need a minimum of 4 GB RAM, 64-bit core processor, either Intel or AMD, storage capacity of at least 10 gigabytes or more, and also a Windows or Mac operating system. Now, some Linux operating systems work to host virtualization. However, not all of them. So a few you would have to check that manually, which distributions work. And you can also check the link to see which ones do work. I remember they have a link to a few Linux distros, so you can check that out. So let's break this down more visually, because saying it verbally is somewhat okay, but visually understanding it is a lot better. So on this example, visual representation, we have the server. The server is basically your bare metal computer where its components are there. Like I said, you have CPU, you have RAM, you have the persistent storage, so hard disks, stuff like that. That's all in the server. Then you have the host OS. That could be either Mac, Windows, Linux, depending on which ones are you're using and which ones are compatible. That's the one that's running. Then you have a hypervisor. Hypervisor basically is spawns up virtual machines and is also software that's such as VMware and VirtualBox. Those are two examples that I'm going to be focusing on in this session. So on top of that, we're going to be creating guest OSs. So once you start up a virtual machine, it's going to create its own column. Each of them are isolated, so they don't interact with your computer, your host OS, and they can't interact with each other unless you give them some type of microservice that they had to communicate with. Then that's when you can communicate with different virtualized machines. And then you have other things like the bins and libraries that's on top of the OS, that's libraries and dependencies for the guest operating system. And then you have applications running on each of those virtual machines. So this is an example of three virtual machines. However, technically, there is still resources being used by your host operating system. So that's taking up processing power and taking up resources. So a few of those examples would be like Chrome, Spotify, Zoom, and other things you might have open for the kernel. So those are things that will be running on behind while also having a virtualization environment running. So this will make or could make your host OS or your virtual OS slow and unresponsive. So that's just something to be aware of. So how do we get started, right? So hypervisor, what is that? That's basically just software that takes advantages of your components on your hardware. So a few, like I said, VMware and VirtualBox. They both work. They just had different UI layouts, so they both do the same thing. It's just depending on which one is better. VirtualBox is open source. VMware, you need to pay, so that's up to you. Now, Virtual OS, what is that exactly? So for ISO images are basically a file that can store lots of dependency files to boot up a operating system. So it's kind of like a snapshot of an operating system that can be started up at a specific virtualized environment. So that's the breakdown of what an ISO image is. So resources, again, you can check out these links from slides. You can download VirtualBox, which is what we're going to be using. Make sure you download the latest one for your operating system. So if you're a Mac user, download the Mac. Windows, download the Windows. Alternatively, VMware Fusion for Macs is available through the eStore for USF students. So if you have that available and you haven't downloaded it yet, I would suggest if you want to try VMware, you can download that, although we will not be doing this specifically on these slides. So we will also be installing Ubuntu 20 point something, the latest version. So LTS, make sure you download the LTS version because that's the long-term support that we're trying to go for. It's less glitchy and less prone to crash on us. So, like I said, VirtualBox and VMware, you can choose whichever one. Just one thing to note, VMware Fusion is specifically for Mac. So if you want VMware, make sure you choose VMware and Workstation, I believe it is, for Windows users. And VirtualBox, well, it's compatible for both Windows and Mac OS. So one thing to know is when you download VirtualBox, you will have to make sure you go to your settings and allow access to VirtualBox. So when I did this first, I was getting crashes and errors. So make sure when you download VirtualBox and then you go to your settings, make sure to allow to give it access. This link shows the error I had. So this is a useful link if you get that same error on Mac. So you could do that. You can go from block to allow. And then I believe this one requires a reboot. So you might want to reboot later down the line. Otherwise, you can reboot now. But the slides will be there, so you can always come back to reference this. Additionally, because virtual machines require input from your keyboard, you want to also allow input monitoring for VirtualBox. So you also go to settings and security and privacy, and under the privacy tab, and then scroll down to the input monitoring, you can select VirtualBox and allow it. This one, I believe, does not require a reboot as far as I remember. So Ubuntu, we're going to download this version. So make sure you start downloading now if you want to follow along and participate. The download is going to be long, so make sure to have time and enough bandwidth to download it. So Once you have this, make sure you know where it's downloaded into. So if your downloads go into your downloads folder, make sure it's there once it's completed so that we can use it later down the line. All right. So by this point, I'm assuming everyone has VirtualBox installed and they have the latest version of Ubuntu ISO image downloaded. So with those two things already set and preset already, does anyone have any questions at the time before I continue? Did I go over something too quickly or did I go at a good pace? Nobody lost? All right. If you do have questions, please stop me. I'm willing to stop and clarify anything I might have gone over too fast. All right. So, like I said, assuming you have everything done, let's set this up. So when you first open up VirtualBox, you'll be greeted with this type of display, this UI display. So this is the normal like setup where you could do a new machine, and that's what we're going to be doing. So to create a new virtual machine, we also want to store it somewhere on our machine, on our host machine. So it's going to be a folder. Can't see your screen. Oops. Can you see my screen now? Can someone verify if you can see my screen?
Yeah. We can see the presentation.
Okay. So, like I was saying, so this is basically the startup menu. Now, because you're going to be creating.
We can't see. We can't see your. Are you trying to show us the VirtualBox steps?
No, I'm still on the slides.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I misunderstood that. I thought there was something we weren't seeing.
Okay, no, not yet. We're not doing the VirtualBox just yet. I just want to clarify something before that. So the thing I want to clarify is because we're doing virtual machines, they're going to take up space on our memory, on our hard disk memory or solid state drive memory, and we want to make sure you specify where that location is going to be. So for instance, if you have an external hard drive that you want to store your virtual machines in, what you want to do is go to preferences, and then in the default machine folder, you want to navigate into wherever you want to store your virtual machine storage space. So let's say if your local computer is 250 gigabytes and it's not enough for your new virtual machine that needs 50 gigabytes more. So you have a hard disk with a terabyte, so that's enough memory to have. Then you can navigate to your external hard drive, and then that's where the new virtual machine is going to be stored, and it's going to have all its files there. So that's just something to be aware of. If you need to do that, you can do that on the preferences. So moving on, let's see. So you can click the new, and then you'll get this or similar setup. For me, preferably, I like to go to the expert mode so that I can see everything and all the settings that I can do and mess around with. So I clicked on expert mode, and then I'm greeted with this. Because I know my ISO image is Ubuntu, I want to give the name Ubuntu to my virtual machine. Once I do that, VirtualBox automatically changes the type and version to be Linux and Ubuntu 64-bit. However, if it doesn't for some reason on yours, make sure you change that. And then you can see my machine folder is going to be located on that directory. So once you do that, you can also make sure the other settings are set appropriately. So for instance, if you want to change the virtual machine RAM, you can do that here. So for me, I chose 1 gigabyte is enough for mine. So this is just the virtualized RAM that it occupies, and also similar to the actual RAM it's going to be taking up. So that's just something you can set up here. As I listed on the slides, you can do 1, 2, 4, 8 gigabytes, depending on your own host operating system capacity. I would say stick to the green and not to the orange or red, because then that's going to get slower. All right, and make sure you have the create a virtual hard disk now option selected, and then you can click create. When you do that, you're gonna get this new window, and then you're gonna make sure everything is set appropriately. For the file size, that's the actual hard disk space that's gonna be used. So for my virtual machine, it's gonna be 10 gigabytes as in total capacity. And then you can move that more or less depending up to you, but preferably stick to whatever it gives you or more. So I left mine at 10, so that's fine. I also made sure to click the dynamically allocated. That way it starts off smaller than 10 gigabytes and then it grows as needed up until 10 gigabytes. And then make sure to have VDI selected for the VirtualBox disk image. Now you can mess around with this later, but for right now, we're just gonna be focused on VDI. So now that you have that set up, that's basically just allocating memory space on your computer. That's basically having everything set so that you can create and install a new virtual machine. Now, this wasn't exactly an install. This was more like a setup, a pre-setup before the actual install. So in your whole hard drive, you have a lot of files, and all you did is specify this section in your hard drive to be specifically for this Ubuntu virtual machine. So that's all you did. And now the next thing we want to do is actually we want to set up the whole ISO install next. So what we do is we scroll down a little bit on the details to the storage label. And then on the storage label, we can see optical drive is empty. So what we want to do is click that. And when you do click that, it's going to give you a little selection of either two options. Make sure you select the one that says choose/create a disk image. So once you do that, you're gonna get greeted with this little pop-up screen. And then all you're gonna do is say add, and then a directory of where your file, and a new pop-up directory will appear. Navigate to your downloads folder or wherever you move the ISO file, and then select that. So again, you go to optical drive empty, make sure you click choose and create a disk image, and then go to add, and then navigate to wherever your ISO file for Ubuntu is and select that one. So once you choose that one, you're going to be able to select it from this optional virtual selector, and then you click on it and then click choose. So once you have that, you should have optical drive and then the ISO image for Ubuntu. So it's no longer empty, and now you have Ubuntu right there. So give me 1 second because someone came in. All right. So as I said, so once you have this set up, you have the optical drive there. So now we can do the actual install. So now we made sure to select which ISO image we want to install. We already allocated the memory on our computer. So now let's do the actual install. We press the start. So let me navigate a little bit. That we press the start button, this arrow key, the green one. And then once we do, we are greeted with this little pop-up that says, all right, it's starting up for the first time, and it's gonna be doing a little checking. It's gonna take some time. Once it's done, you're gonna get a different screen. But a few things to note. If yours doesn't work or is getting some type of error, I would say go back to the previous step where I said, like, make sure you have the settings set up where you allow it and allow permissions. So assuming you do that, you shouldn't get any error at this point. But if you do get an error, try Googling the error. I'm sure it's a common error that you might get. So Google the error if you're stuck. Otherwise, try settings and check if that's going to be helpful. So once that's done checking, you get greeted with this. So this is going to say try Ubuntu or install Ubuntu. Make sure you select install. All right. So we're installing not on your host operating system, but actually on the virtually created sandbox area that we already did previously. So it's going to install in that area and only in that area. So once we do install, follow the screen instructions where you can do the keyboard layout. Make sure you choose your own. And then you can do updates and other software. Preferably, it's up to you depending on your time. I just did normal installation without the updates. So that's just my preference. You can do with the little checkbox right here, although it will take a little bit longer, but it will save time after the installation. So I'm assuming nobody did this. So my slides will assume that you did not click this checkbox. So make sure you have erase disk and install Ubuntu option selected, install now, and then continue. Then it's going to take some time, and then you're going to do where are you? Make sure you check your wherever you are located. And then it's going to do some more time and preparation, installation. Then it's going to ask you for your username and who you are and your password. So for me, I just chose cool, and then I automatically gave my computer name cool-virtualbox, and then my username also became cool. So that's what it does automatically. You can choose your own username if you want. And then for password, make sure you use a unique password only for this virtual machine. Don't reuse an old password or an existing password, such as the one you use for USF portal. And make sure you write these down, your username and password on a piece of paper. You're going to be required to use these later down the line. So once you have this set up, make sure you can also click one of these options to log in automatically or require login on boot up. I just leave it as is. So moving on, it's going to do some installation. It's going to take some time. And then once it's done, it's going to require a restart. Now this is going to restart your virtual machine, not your host operating system. So don't worry, this is just going to be doing the virtual machine. Click restart, and then it's going to say remove the installation medium. Just press enter. It'll do that automatically. So then once it starts rebooting, it's going to actually start rebooting as Ubuntu would normally would. Then you're going to sign in, your username, your password, and then you're going to be greeted with like, okay, setup. So this is just user account setup. You can skip this if you want. You don't need to set this up, but you can skip it. It's going to ask you for things if you want things to be patched. So LTS does long-term support. So if there's a patch needed, it'll make sure that a patch gets set up. So make sure you click yes on that one, in my opinion. And then you can do optional for this, and then you should be done. And then that should be Ubuntu installed. However, we're not done yet, because now what we want to do is we click down here on the like 9 square boxes, and then we go and type on the search bar terminal. We click a terminal icon, and then we're greeted with a terminal screen. So for, like I said, for my option, I selected not to do the latest downloads and updates for this. So now I need to make up for those. And this is useful also for when you start up your computer later down the line and there's actual updates or upgrades needed to do. So what you do is basically type in sudo apt-get update. And then it's going to require your password for your username. So it's not going to be appearing, but it's going to appear like you're not typing anything. However, you are actually typing onto the line. So your virtual machine is still getting input. It's just not displaying the characters. So once you press in your password, it's going to do a little bit of work, and then it should be done. And then what you do next is basically navigate on your host operating system. Assuming you have a Mac, you go to the top tab, and then you go to devices. Once you click devices, you're going to see insert guest editions. So this is basically, because we're doing a virtual machine, Ubuntu assumes it has free reign on the whole operating system and the whole disk space and all the resources available from your actual hardware. However, that's not the case because it's a virtual machine instead. So what we need to do is basically add these additions to Ubuntu so that it realizes it's a virtual machine and that it optimizes better for actual virtual machine usability. So you can look more into that on the link. It's a better explanation than what this says, but once you do, make sure you click insert guest additions, and then you're going to be greeted with this pop-up on Ubuntu. Make sure you click run, and then it's going to ask you for your password. Type in your password, and then it's going to do its own thing. It's going to take maximum 3 minutes, and then once that's done, it's going to say, okay, press enter to close the window. Restart this computer, restart Ubuntu now. Make sure you restart, and then once you go back, your Ubuntu setup is complete. So that's basically the installation process from VirtualBox to Ubuntu to actually setting up dependency updates and upgrades. One thing you want to do afterwards is install other things like Spotify, Visual Studio, or other things you want to do. So that's just something to keep in mind if you want to do. This is useful to do. Now that I have a virtual machine, what happens if I break it, right? What if I installed something or I typed in something on the terminal and I don't know what exactly I did because I was following a Stack Overflow instruction and then it turned out that it wasn't what I needed, and now my virtual machine is broken or my whole dependency file is broken or something happened. So what we did now is installed Ubuntu, and then I broke my virtual machine Ubuntu. So I would need to delete my virtual machine and then reinstall Ubuntu, create a new username, create a new password. What if it breaks up again? So this basically is too complicated, too time consuming, redundant, and you lose all your files. So there is a solution. It's called Snapshots. So Snapshots is basically takes a snapshot of your whole virtual machine, and then it's saved into your computer. So whenever you need a new snapshot or a previous snapshot, you can respawn back into that time. So think of it as in a game, a checkpoint, and then if you mess up or something, you can respawn back to that checkpoint. So that's the breakdown of snapshots. So going back to the scenario I just said, I installed Ubuntu, I created a snapshot, I broke my VM somehow. So what do? I can just restore the last snapshot. So I can do that and I don't need to reinstall, create a whole new user, or do a whole bunch of things that we just did. So this is gonna save time, it's easy to manage, and you can save your data that you made inside your virtual machine. So persistent data is stayed there from the last created snapshot. So basically to do that, what you want to do is navigate onto the little like 3 boxes on Ubuntu. Make sure you select the snapshots. And then once you select snapshots, you create a new snapshot. I named mine initial install because that's after I did all the installation settings and then all the VirtualBox guest editions. So that's my origin for me. You can do yours initially like without the whole guest editions if you want. And there's a few links down below, VirtualBox link to how to use this and what exactly it does, and a YouTube link doing a more extended explanation on how to do snapshots and how to do them extensively with different number of snapshots. So without that, that's basically it. So that's the end. All is completed. And any questions, or if I went over too fast, anything I should clarify at the moment? No? No questions? Everyone understands? All right. So if you do have questions, I would suggest try Googling things. Normally everything's on Google. I would say if you do get stuck or if you do need to do a different type of setup, you can reference the slides. They're going to be public. You're able to see them and follow the links. I made sure to provide you with links so you can do your own research if you want. So without further ado, thank you for coming. Thank you for seeing. And that's it.